Somewhere in space, this may all be happening right now.
As Lucas was working on getting Star Wars from storyboard to the theater, he turned to Charles Lippincott to find a way to promote the film and build up hype. Charles met with many different companies to get them on board to promote Star Wars, but it was one company he knew he just had to get: Marvel Comics. Sure, he could have turned to DC or a smaller comic book company to turn Star Wars into a comic book series, but he wanted the best, and he felt Marvel was the best for the job. He set up a meeting with Marvel's publisher and Marvel god Stan Lee, who told him that Marvel liked to stay with the company's own concept, and at the time was not looking to bring in other properties. Shot down by the father of Marvel Comics, it wasn't looking good for Star Wars. A few years before, around 1975, Marvel's Roy Thompson was having dinner with his friend Ed Summer. Ed ran the Super Snip Comic Emporium in New York, and the two comic book fans would often have dinner together. However, this one time Ed brought along a friend, a silent partner in his comic art emporium, George Lucas. Roy was impressed to meet George Lucas. After all, he was a fan of American Graffiti, released a few years before. As the three talked, it was clear Lucas was familiar with Roy's work as a writer and editor at Marvel. As the dinner got closer to the end, Ed and Lucas started to talk about something Roy had never even heard of: the Star Wars. The name alone got Roy's attention, as he was a fan of the film 2001 and loved that someone like George Lucas was taking on science fiction. He listened to Lucas and Ed talk about the Star Wars, and he wasn't really sure what it was about. He did pick up quickly that it was a science fiction adventure story. The dinner would end with not much else said about Lucas's next film. However, over the next few months, Roy would learn little tidbits about the film thanks to Ed. About a year later, in early 1976, Ed dropped by Roy's apartment with a friend. Not George Lucas this time, but the man that was working with George Lucas, Charles Lippincott. Roy learned that Star Wars was now filming, and they really wanted to get Marvel on board to turn the film into a comic book and an ongoing series. Lucas and Charles felt the movie was perfect for the comic book readers, and they would really want to see the film after reading the comic. Roy liked the plan for sure, but he reminded Ed that he was no longer the editor-in-chief at Marvel, and was now only a writer and editor of a handful of Marvel titles. His biggest at the time was Conan the Barbarian series, that was in 1976 Marvel's biggest comic book series, even outselling Spider-Man. Charles let Roy know that it was due to the success and quality of Conan the Barbarian that he was there meeting with Roy. It was clear to Lucas and Charles that Roy was the man to take on Star Wars, but Roy let them know it was not up to him, that they would have to get Stan Lee to agree to the series. Charlie sadly let Roy know that he had already met with Stan Lee and had been turned down. To Roy, there wasn't much to say after that. If Stan Lee said no, there was nothing anyone else could do. But Charles wasn't ready to give up just yet. He opened his briefcase and pulled out paintings, full-color production drawings done by Ralph McQuarrie. He would show each one to Roy, and with each one tell him a backstory of the beautiful scene. He saw the desert planet of Tatooine, heard how Luke Starkiller would befriend two lovable robots, have to rescue a princess who was captured by the evil Darth Vader. Roy's head was spinning. He kept thinking how it seemed like Wizard of Oz in space. But it was one photo that Charles would flip down that really hooked Roy. The painting of the cantina scene. Humans versus aliens in a face-off, looking like something out of a strange western. Roy, without a doubt, was hooked. It didn't matter what else Roy was shown. He didn't even really follow the story Charles was telling him after that. He had seen and heard all he needed to know. He made up his mind there. He would do all that he could to change Stan Lee's mind. He couldn't promise anything, but he would do his best. Sadly, how Roy or someone changed Stan Lee's mind is a little unknown, as memories of the events have faded over the years. Stan Lee would say in an interview that he was sold on Star Wars from the time he was told Alec Guinness was going to be a part of it. Was that true? If so, maybe Charles Lippincott left that out in his meeting with Stan Lee. Or maybe it was Roy Thompson that told Stan Lee that Alec Guinness was attached to the film. Sadly, it's not really clear. What did happen? Roy was given the job to write and edit the Star Wars film into a 6-part series for Marvel. A team was put together. Comic book artist Howard Chaykin would be brought on board to draw the comics. Howard and Roy got copies of the script and plot details from Lucas's office. The two got so much that they saw a lot of early plans that were dropped well before filming had started on the movie. With the notes, the script, and whatever stills they could get from Charles Lippincott, Howard started drawing. But not everyone was happy. Marvel's circulation director was very unhappy that the company planned a 6-part series of a movie with no major stars. They also hated that the deal stated that Marvel had to release 2 of the 6 issues before the release of the film. They fought with Roy to get the series down to 2 issues, or maybe even 1. But Roy knew he needed at least 6 issues to get the story right. He told him he would do it in a 6-part series, or they could just find someone else. It was up to them. Roy stayed on and did the 6-part series, but the higher-ups at Marvel were still worried, with some saying they wish Marvel never got mixed up with the Star Wars film. At least that's how they felt before the release of the film. Roy went to work and soon found himself bored and confused by the script. Without the visuals, it just wasn't exciting. But he kept on, and Howard kept drawing, and the two dug in. But it seemed doing the art and inking for Howard was just too much. He only really had time to do rough pencils, so Steve Larnhar was brought in for issues 2 through 5, with Rick Helberg, Bill Lay, and Dave Steven coming in for issue 6 to do the inking. Work got done, and Roy set up a small little buffet for friends at Charles Lipnickott's home. Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, and even Mark Hamill would show up to celebrate. A few months later, Roy, Howard, and others that worked on the comic were invited to Lucas's home to watch a rough cut of Star Wars. On the way, the two would share a ride with 20th Century Fox's president, Alan Ladd Jr., who was Lucas's biggest supporter at Fox. Roy told Alan that he felt the movie would be great, and Alan looked at him with a long-suffering face and said, "We sure hope so," as it was clear to even them Alan's fate at Fox was on the line when it came to the success of Star Wars. They arrived at Lucas's home to watch the rough cut, a cut so early that the opening crawl was totally different. And that original crawl, the one they saw that night, was the one that was used for issue 1 of the Star Wars comic book. After the crawl, the blockade runner appeared, being chased by the huge Imperial Star Destroyer. Even with it being a rough cut on a small screen, everyone in the room was impressed. Inside the blockade runner, they saw stormtroopers and rebels firing laser guns at each other, with the lasers being hand-drawn in. The evil Darth Vader entered with a muffled English accent. One thing Roy quickly noticed was that a scene of Luke Skywalker and his friend Biggs Darklighter was not in the film, yet he knew it would be in the comic. It was too late to take it out. Soon after the release of the film, some would write into Marvel upset, asking how dare they add things to George Lucas's movie. During the film's final battle, it was cut together with old World War II dogfight clips. Roy would say some years later that it was a surreal experience. After the film, Roy and the others all knew that if the special effects held up, it would be a very good movie, but that didn't mean it would be a very popular movie. The film ended, and then they watched footage of some of the special effect guys blowing up models. Roy said that it was clear the group of filmmakers really liked George Lucas, and everybody was hoping that the film would be a huge success. Roy left excited and happy, but would note years later it would be the last time he had a pleasant experience when it came to Star Wars or George Lucas. Roy Thomas was excited to be working with Lucasfilm and Marvel on the upcoming comic for Star Wars. Work had already started up to bring the movie from the screen to the pages, and Roy and others had just saw a private screening of a rough cut of Star Wars. He loved the movie and the people there to show the film. But leaving the screening, Roy would say that was the last time Star Wars was a pleasant experience for him. Leaving that screening, no one knew what Star Wars would become. But even if they felt it might be a good film and a hit film, no one could have seen what was to come. That the release would change everything, from movies, from marketing, to toys, to even the Star Wars comics. Once Star Wars was released, it was clear this was more than just some movie. Lucasfilm was ready to keep Star Wars comics going beyond the film. Roy thought it would be excellent to continue the adventures, but very soon after the release of the film, he found out that his hands were tied very tightly on what he could and couldn't do next with Star Wars. Due to the success of the film, it was without a doubt Star Wars would get a sequel, so that meant he had to put a hold on the characters and the story for sure. He was told he would not be allowed to use Darth Vader at all, and he was in no way advance the relationship between Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia, or Han Solo and Princess Leia. There was more that he couldn't do, and little that he could do. Roy told Starlog magazine in 1987 that he felt he wasn't allowed to do anything but run in place. Roy wanted and needed his freedom, so he looked at what he could do. Being that his favorite character was Han Solo, he met with George Lucas with a Han Solo story. He wanted to do Magnificent Seven type storyline after the run of the movie comics. Lucas loved that plan and told Roy to start work right away. The series would be 4 issues, number 7 through 10. He wrote the story and had Howard Chuckland do the layout. He then got a call from Lucas's film, Charlie Lippincott. Lucas had got the issues, and he wasn't happy with it. Roy reminded Charlie that Lucas had already approved the story. How could he not like him? It seems that Lucas felt the story was too much like Magnificent Seven, and there was one character Lucas didn't like. In fact, he downright hated, and he felt it wasn't right for Star Wars. That was a 7-foot-tall green rabbit named Jack. Lucas felt it looked like something that belonged in a Bugs Bunny cartoon and not in Star Wars. Roy would say that he was inspired to do the character by a Porky Pig-like alien he saw in the cantina scene. He figured the green rabbit wasn't much wilder than that, and really not more wilder than a Wookiee. But it was clear Lucas didn't think the same. It was then Roy said he knew he loved the movie, but really had no interest in continuing Star Wars. He was an artist that needed freedom and his own playground, but Lucas was the owner of the sandbox and would have a say what would happen in it. He understood what Lucas was doing, but it wasn't something that he could be a part of. But it wasn't just the tight grip of Lucas that was putting Roy off Star Wars. He had found out that Alan Dean Foster, who had ghost-written the Star Wars novel, received a very sizable bonus after the release of the film. The cast of the film was given extra profit points as a thank you for the success of the film. So he wanted and felt he deserved extra. So he waited and waited. All he got was his normal comic book rate for Marvel, plus $2 per page for each time the first 6 issues got reprinted. Roy decided to speak up, cause it seems waiting just wasn't going to get him anything. And finally he got a bonus, but it was not from Lucasfilm, but from Marvel, a check for $500. He really didn't feel like he was being appreciated, and really not by Lucasfilm. After all, the first 2 issues came out, sold great, and was released to promote the film. Everyone else got a big thank you, but he wasn't getting anything but rules. Now Roy said he wasn't really upset with Marvel, as those Star Wars comics and its reprint will become the highest selling comic book at the time. He even told Starlog magazine that he really had no beef with George Lucas. He knew with all that was going on with the success of Star Wars, the comic book that helped promote it was probably the last thing on George Lucas's mind. All he ever hoped for was a little extra for the help, but he never got anything but grief from George Lucas. So Roy called back Charles Lippincott and let him know after the Solo story he was out, and to let George Lucas know that it was fun being part of Star Wars. He would be replaced with Marvel legend Archie Goodwin as writer, and Roy would say that Archie had a lot more fun working within the limits of Lucasfilm and gave it a lot more of his love. Archie loved writing Star Wars. He would even go on to write the Star Wars newspaper strip. Roy went back to work on Conan the Barbarian. Sure, it wasn't his character, but its creator, Robert E. Howard, had died 4 years before Roy was even born. That gave him almost as much freedom as writing his own character. When asked by Starlog if he had to do it all over again, Roy said without a question he would do it all again the same way. And then he gave a smile and said, mostly the same. What would he have done differently? Roy said that he would ask Lucas for a bonus the day after Star Wars opened.